Hey students, it's Mrs. T, and we are going to finish up our discussion today about the components of social structure. We are going to talk about social groups. Okay, so social groups was the last one of our circles, that were intertwined when we first talked about social structure a couple of videos ago. So we have social institutions, which is on the macro scale, statuses and roles, which kind of is the bridge between macro and micro. So we spent a lot of time talking about that recently. And then social groups, those are our micro level experiences that we have in society, but they are linked to, our positions within our social groups, the statuses and roles that we live out with our social players that we interact with on a daily basis. This is where we live our life experiences and live out those statuses and roles with the role expectation, role performance, role distancing, all of the different vocabulary words that I asked you to be familiar with from chapter 4. So with social groups, when we talk about our micro place within a larger macro society, what we are doing is we are going to examine the norms that we live by in our daily life. We're going to examine the feedback that we get from others in our social group and look at the way we behave in relation to other people, not in a psychological way by like the way that your brain functions or something like that, but the way that a human being in a social group with a certain set of norms that exist on the macro scale, how that trickles down into the statuses and roles that are part of our daily life experience, kind of like the rule book that we follow in our daily life experience as we move through life from one social group to the next. So let's get some keywords that have to go into a good explanation, a good definition of what a social group is. First of all you need is 2 or more people. That's it, 2 or more. And sometimes we had a debate last semester, I think it was, somebody said, well, what if I'm on, a chat room with somebody who's in South Korea or something? Yes, absolutely. You don't have to be face to face. It's just 2 or more people, but interaction, regular interaction. Let me stick that adjective in front of this. It has to be regular or frequent social interaction. So you can't just be another person on an elevator going up to the 5th floor because, and call that a social group, because there has to be regular interaction with the same people in order for you to have the beginnings of what is called a social group. So 2 or more people, regular interaction, something that bonds them together so that regular interaction is possible. Some sort of bond. We'll talk about the types of bonds here in just a second, but it has to have some type of bond, and there has to be some kind of component of your social identity and the other people's social identity wrapped up into your social group. So social identity is part of being a member of a social group. So if you were defining this term in your own words, you would need to have these 4 concepts in a good definition of social groups in order for it to be correct. And this self-identity or social identity, I think I said self-identity, I wrote the word social. Social identity, but also self-identity come from social groups. Social identity means, how do I see you? Well, hopefully you think of you and me as having a friendly relationship. I like to have friendliness as part of the professionalism that I exhibit when I'm interacting with you. I find that friendliness means that we have better interactions and means that we make more progress, whether we're learning or figuring out instructions or working on a deadline, whatever it is that we are doing, whatever type of interaction we are having. I find that friendliness is a very, very useful behavior to have between you and between me when we're going about the business of the bond that we share. The bond that we share right now is teacher and student. Teacher and student, by definition, our social identity, those people are not friends. Friend is another social identity. And friendliness that we have with friends is a different kind of friendliness than we have in professionalism. You see what I mean? So my social identity to you It should be, and probably is, teacher, professora, however you think of me. Social identity, I'm your teacher. Your social identity to me, you are my student. When I see folks out and about in public, when my husband and I would go to restaurants or something, and somebody would be a wait, on the wait staff, or go to the mall, and somebody would work in one of those stores, and my husband would be with me. They'd be like, "Hey, Miss T." I'm like, "Oh, here's my husband. This is my student, right? Not this is my old friend." So and so, but this is my former student, this is my current student. I identify you to my husband as a student. I will say to you, this is my husband, and so I identify him as a social identity. Husband comes from family, the social institution, and husband, the status comes with a role, and so immediately you will know some of the parameters of my relationship with that person compared to my relationship with you, right? So these words that we use, the social identity, kind of should be an alarm should kind of go off to say, okay, I've got a relationship between myself and this person that's governed by the statuses and the roles that lots of husbands and wives, lots of teachers and students have all across society. And those statuses and roles, the norms and the social facts on the macro scale that exist because of those things come from the education system, come from family structure. Maybe you can even argue that it comes from economy also, because why do you need a teacher like me? Because you're trying to achieve a certain role in the economy later on. And why does husband have a different status and role than wife? Because of those economic functions in the household, perhaps. So, excuse me. Our social groups, pardon me. Oh, I don't know what I swallowed, but it's gone now. Okay, so those social groups that we belong to are never just our own, really. They are governed by the statuses and roles that we occupy within those social groups. And those statuses and roles come from the norms associated with the macro scale social institutions that are part of our social structure. Okay. So, pardon me again. I know I talk a little fast. Maybe that's why I swallowed something and coughed about it. So if you need to pause this, rewind it. I think on YouTube you can slow me down a little bit. I know some people like to speed me up so it gets over faster. But these are, a lot of good points that I've gone over quickly here that are probably going to help you a lot with Project 2 that I'm going to post later on this week. So rewind this and watch it again if you need to. Let me erase these key words and let's leave social groups up here, because now we're going to talk about a couple of different types of social groups, okay? And you have seen this in Chapter 4 probably. We have what's called primary groups, and we have what's called secondary groups. Now, these words are not fancy, they just mean first and second, and the reason they're called primary and secondary group has to do with your socialization process. So socialization is that lifelong learning process where we get the information that we need to know so that we get by in our social life, we can participate in society, and also develop that self-identity that we talked about so often. So our primary groups are really, really important for socialization because we spend more time with these people. We have stronger bonds, emotional bonds with these people. Secondary groups you're going to have some socialization process go on in secondary groups because any life experience creates an opportunity for a socialization process to happen. But in secondary groups, it's less profound, it's less significant to your socialization process because secondary groups tend to be temporary. They tend to have more members and have like a different kind of bond associated with it. So let's talk about what all these kinds of bonds are and the size and the type of interaction that each of these have, because we have 4 key things that every social group has. So let's get some further details so we can distinguish a primary group from a secondary group for a second. Okay, so primary groups, they tend to be small, whereas secondary groups can be much larger. So they can be large numbers of people. I would consider our classroom, even though not all 25 of us have been present in the classroom all at once this semester, any classroom full of people is a larger number of people. The typical family or the typical household members made up of 4 or 5 or 6 members, that tends to be a smaller or what we would call a primary group. So it's a small number of people compared to a larger number of people. And for primary groups, you have a particular type of interaction. Remember, for a social group, you are supposed to have regular interaction to be considered a group. In a primary group, you tend to have much more personal and much more intimate interaction that is possible with those people, that you're comfortable doing with those people. So this is intimate interaction, which means like you would tell your secrets to these people. They know your strengths and weaknesses. You cry on their shoulder. You have maybe more of an emotional bond. Your emotional bonds are called expressive bonds, expressive ties. That's another word. These two things are interchangeable. This is a particular expressive ties is a particular vocabulary word from chapter 4, but we have expressive ties with members of our primary group, meaning we have emotional connections with them, and therefore they are the type of people with whom we have more personal, more intimate interactions with. Also, our social identity is strongly linked to our primary groups because we have really long-term social identity associated with our primary groups. Think about our family memberships here. Your mom is your mom for your entire life, whether she dies early, dies late, you die before her, she's your mom, you're her son or daughter. These kinds of things are very long-term social identity kind of issues. Okay. Secondary groups, I kind of got crazy with my last 4 things on the list over here. Secondary groups, you do have interaction regularly, but it tends to be more business-like. You tend to have some sort of business at hand that you're trying to achieve. So, business-like interaction. But remember what I just said about the way you and I interact with each other? Friendliness is part of the way the business you and I need to do with each other. It's part of the way we get that business done effectively, right? So even though you can have a very friendly-ish relationship with someone in your secondary group. For instance, I've told all of you what's going on intimately in my household with my father, and that's why I'm out of the classroom with you so much right now. Thank you for working with me on that and being patient. I'm telling you this because the business we need to transact with each other has to have a certain outcome if it's going to be successful, and your good grades, when you earn a C or better, and I help you do that, that's what the business of what we're engaged in is all about, right? And the friendliness and sometimes knowing personal details about each other is part of how we work through the deadlines, the things that are part of our business-like relationship for the time being, right? So you really have to kind of zoom out and analyze this business-like interaction, because friendliness and personal sharing is often part of a successful business-like interaction plan, right? So, in general, secondary groups, instead of expressive ties that bring us together like love and fondness, we would have something that's called a goal-oriented bond. It's called an instrumental tie. Instrumental ties. Okay, so these are the same thing as each other, a goal-oriented bond or an instrumental tie. This means that we have a purpose that's binding us together, not simply because we love each other, because we have affection, not because of those things that keep us coming back to each other on a personal scale, but the reason you're watching my YouTube channel is because you have a goal to finish this successfully at the end, right? And the reason you come to class, the reason you visit Blackboard, the reason you participate in those kinds of activities that I put out there for you is because you have a goal, right? And I know what your goal is. I'm here to help you with that goal. We're going to do it in a business-like, friendly-ish way so that you can achieve that goal in the long run. Okay? For at least a temporary period of time, you get some of your social identity from secondary group memberships. So at least a temporary social identity. Okay? So for instance, is student supposed to be a permanent part of your social identity? No. I mean, you didn't even have to pause and think about that one. Student is not supposed to be part of your permanent social identity. But right now, when you meet each other, or when you meet somebody, or when you're seeing them over the holidays, hopefully you'll be able to have some family gatherings and get out and do some semi-normal holiday stuff this season. Student is going to be some of what you talk about with people you haven't seen for a while. So you're going to make it part of your social identity, even though it's a secondary group. Student, by definition, is a temporary kind of situation. You're supposed to be graduate at some point, and the reason you're supposed to be graduate is because you're supposed to be employee at some point, right? You're always working toward that occupation, education, and income level that we talked about in the statuses and roles discussion, and it'll be a major source of conversation in Chapter 7 when we get to that. So there's a whole bunch of different statuses and roles that come from the social institutions that exist in society, but we live them out in our social groups. Some of the social groups that we live out are primary groups, some are secondary groups. Our classroom is an example I'm going to give to you as a secondary group. Our families are examples that I'm going to give to you as primary groups, but can you come up with other examples? For instance, a lot of you, not all, but a lot of you are churchgoers. And church has a very kind of intimate, goal-oriented reason why you're affiliated with the church, right? It's got a lot of friendliness among the members. It's got a lot of, in some cases, a significant part of your social identity comes from the fact that you are a churchgoer or the particular denomination to which you belong. So where does church go here? Because sometimes we have a really long-term relationship with the same church for our entire life. And a lot of times our belief system, because of ethnocentrism, remember, our belief system is extremely, vitally important to us and part of our social identity. But is it a secondary group or is it a primary group? Does it tend to have a large congregation? Even though you have friendliness and kind of personal stuff, especially if you get together and talk about sin and salvation, you're going to be spilling some stuff in your soul, right? But isn't it really a business-like interaction? Aren't you working toward a goal-oriented focus of the afterlife? And even though in some cases it's not a temporary social ID for us, is it necessarily the first social identification that people assign to you or that your master status would be? Maybe a nun, or maybe a priest, or maybe somebody who actually wears the costume, so to speak, of their faith, has that as their primary social identity in the eyes of others. But what about you? So it's an interesting thing. Maybe you should write your reaction paper about that this week. Is if you are a churchgoer, is church a primary group or a secondary group? I think I know where I would put it. I think I know where your sociology book puts it. Don't look it up if you haven't looked it up yet or read it. But try to analyze your situation and see, does it go here? Does it go there? Remember, zoom out and don't place a lot of over-importance on the relationships that you might or might not have with individuals within the church. If you have special relationships with individuals within school, within church, within work, within anywhere, is that necessarily a church group or a work group or, a school group? If you have paired off and made special relationships like boyfriend-girlfriend or BFFs, that's maybe a different kind of group that you got from your secondary group membership, but maybe you became a primary group with somebody because you met them in your secondary group experience. Okay, So think about that, analyze that about yourself, and maybe use that as a reaction paper this week. Okay, one more short topic about social groups. This is branching over into Chapter 5, the sections of Chapter 5 that we're going to talk about. There are some particular vocabulary words I want to call your attention to: in-groups, out-groups, and reference groups. Okay? In-groups, out-groups, and reference groups. An in-group is a group to which you belong. An out-group is any group around you that you are aware of, but you do not belong to them. You might be able to refer to them and identify yourself as not being a member because you refer to your in-group members in order to model your behavior, model your clothing style, your speech patterns, your behavior, that kind of stuff. So your in-group is any group that you belong to. Your out-group is everybody else that is outside of that collection of people. And a reference group is anyone that you literally, look at this word, refer to for your behavior, for approval. Think about your reference group also as peers. Your peers often their opinion of you often is very important, and therefore you might look to peers and peers' behavior to model your behavior after in order to perhaps assume or hope that those folks would approve of you. So think about the relationship between in-groups, out-groups, and reference groups to those primary and secondary groups that we just discussed. And how these kinds, as you're reading those few pages in Chapter 5 that talks about in-groups, out-groups, and reference groups, think about how you model your behavior after social experiences, perhaps way more than what a psychology teacher would tell you, that your behavior comes from inside yourself and your personality. That's part of like the way your brain is linked to you and your self identity. But in sociology, we look instead at the way we bounce off and kind of reflect behaviors and assumptions. Remember, with symbolic interactionism on the micro scale, we interpret what we see around us. We use symbols to interpret what reality really is, and then we respond to that and kind of create and contribute other layers of reality onto that. So examine your behavior within your primary and secondary groups, and think about how your examples in your past life may be where your behavior has changed. You've intentionally modified it for the purpose of being accepted by members in your in-group or primary groups, or how your behavior has had to temporarily change to be accepted or be successful in your goal orientation in your secondary groups. Those kinds of things. So maybe you need to rewind, pardon me, this part of the video also to try to get all those key terms into your vocabulary and keep them straight. I've had a couple of private conferences with several of you and your classmates lately, and each one of you, each time I've talked to somebody, you tell me, you talk so fast. And I'm sorry, I opened a Diet Coke right before I started this and I put it down. I thought, no more caffeine for Miss T before she does this lecture. So anyway, I'm sorry that I talk too quickly, but I like this stuff. I like to talk about it. I want you to see your connection between yourself and society, because it's there, people. It's really there. And hopefully you're growing and you see that your participation in our secondary group, which is called sociology class, is going to have a positive impact moving forward when we are no longer part of this secondary group together. Okay, so please text me with questions. I hope you can get some good ideas for reaction papers from this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.